Can you save a man by taking away his shadow? Not his freedom, not his name, his shadow. The thing that falls behind him when he walks among other people. The proof that he exists in a world that is not empty. In 1829, a group of very serious men in Philadelphia believed the answer was yes. They believed it with the force of Scripture. They believed it with the certainty of architects and theologians and legislators who had never once been locked in a room alone. They called their invention a penitentiary, a place for penitence, a cathedral of silence where the wicked would sit with their sins and emerge, through the sheer pressure of solitude, transformed. They called it a penitentiary. What they built was a machine for industrial-scale madness. And Blackwell has the medical logs from the first year. The story of Eastern State Penitentiary does not begin with a warden or a judge or a prisoner. It begins with a theology. And unless you understand the theology, the architecture makes no sense. The cruelty makes no sense. The 200 years of repetition that followed make no sense at all. The theology belonged to the Quakers, the religious society of Friends. And of all the religious movements in early American history, the Quakers were among the most progressive. They opposed the death penalty decades before most of their contemporaries. They fought against public flogging, branding, and mutilation, all of which were standard punishment in the American colonies and the early republic. They believed, genuinely and fervently, that there was a divine spark in every human being, an inner light, a fragment of God inside even the worst offender. And here is the crucial pivot. If you believe that every person contains this inner light, then punishment is not about revenge. It is about restoration. The goal is not to break the criminal. The goal is to reach that light. The question was how. The Quakers looked at the prisons of the late 1700s and saw chaos. The Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, opened in 1773, was a human warehouse. Men, women, and children were crammed into shared rooms. Violent offenders mixed with petty thieves. Alcohol was sold openly by jailers. Disease was rampant. Assault was constant. The strong preyed on the weak without interruption. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and a physician in Philadelphia, described these conditions and concluded that the old system did not reform anyone. It manufactured criminals. A man who entered for stealing bread left knowing how to forge documents, pick locks, and survive a knife fight. The prison was a school, Rush argued. It simply taught the wrong curriculum. Rush was not a Quaker himself, but he moved in Quaker circles, and his ideas aligned with theirs. Reform the environment, they reasoned, and you reform the man. Remove the chaos. Remove the contamination. Remove every distraction between the prisoner and his own conscience. Remove, in other words, everything. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons was founded in 1787. The name alone tells you something about the era. These were not cynics. They were idealists with political power and architectural ambitions. And their solution was radical. Total isolation. Not as a punishment, as a treatment. The prisoner would be placed alone in a cell. He would see no other prisoner. He would speak to no other prisoner. He would eat alone, sleep alone, work alone, and pray alone. The only voices he would hear would be the chaplain's and his own. The only book he would receive would be the Bible. And in this silence, cut off from every corrupting influence, the inner light would have nowhere to hide. The prisoner would confront his sins. He would repent. He would be reborn. They believed this with total sincerity, and because they believed it with total sincerity, they built the most expensive and most architecturally sophisticated prison in the history of the world to make it real. Eastern State Penitentiary was designed by John Haviland, a British-born architect who had trained in London and arrived in Philadelphia in 1816. The commission was announced in 1821. Haviland won the competition with a design that would influence prison architecture for the next century and beyond. The building was Gothic, not metaphorically, literally Gothic. A massive stone fortress with crenellated walls and a gatehouse that looked like the entrance to a medieval castle. This was deliberate. Haviland wanted the exterior to inspire awe and dread. The building was meant to communicate a message before a single prisoner entered its doors. That message was, "Abandon hope." But the exterior was theatre. The innovation was inside. The layout was a hub-and-spoke design. A central surveillance rotunda, and radiating outward from it, 7 cell blocks like the spokes of a wheel. A guard standing at the center could look down every corridor simultaneously. Each corridor was lined with individual cells, and each cell was self-contained. A bed, a workbench, a toilet, a feeding door through which meals would be passed without human contact, and above each cell, a single skylight. Just one. Haviland called it the Eye of God. Every cell opened onto a small private exercise yard, walled on all sides. No sightline to any other yard. A prisoner could step outside his cell and stand beneath the sky and never see another human face. When a prisoner was moved from one location to another within the building, a hood was placed over his head. A thick black cloth hood. This was not a punishment. It was, in the logic of the system, a kindness. If the prisoner could not see other prisoners, he could not be corrupted by them. If he could not see the layout of the building, he could not plan an escape. The hood protected him. The hood kept his soul clean. There was no noise. Conversation was forbidden. Guards wore socks over their shoes. Wagon wheels in the corridors were wrapped in leather. Cell doors were thick oak. The entire building was engineered to produce a single acoustic condition. Silence. Absolute silence. The first prisoner entered Eastern State Penitentiary on October 25, 1829. His name was Charles Williams, burglar, sentenced to 2 years. He was assigned a number. He was not called by his name again until the day he left. Eastern State opened to enormous public interest. Delegations arrived from across Europe. Alexis de Tocqueville visited in 1831 during the research trip that would produce Democracy in America. He and Gustave de Beaumont wrote a detailed report on the penitentiary system, largely favorable, though Beaumont noted a persistent unease he could not quite name. The international attention was intense. More than 300 prisons worldwide would eventually be modelled on the Eastern State design. 300. From Norway to Argentina, from Japan to Russia, architects and legislators studied Haviland's blueprints and said, "This is the future." And the data from inside the walls was already telling a different story. Blackwell has read the medical logs, the early ones, the ones from 1830, 1831, 1832. The handwriting is cramped, the language is clinical, and the pattern is unmistakable. Prisoner number 44, admitted November 1829. Within 4 months, reported hearing voices, refused food, found rocking in a corner of his cell, striking his head against the stone wall. The physician's note reads, dementia. Prisoner number 67, admitted January 1830. By March, had torn his bedding into strips and attempted to hang himself from the skylight bracket. Removed to the infirmary. Returned to isolation 4 days later. Attempted again within the week. Prisoner number 103, admitted April 1830. By September, was observed talking to someone who was not there, conversing at length, laughing, weeping. The physician noted persistent hallucinations and recommended continued isolation to prevent contamination of other inmates. Recommended continued isolation. The treatment for the madness caused by isolation was more isolation. And this was not the exception, this was the pattern. Across the first 5 years of operation, the rate of what the physicians variously called dementia, monomania, hallucination, and nervous collapse was extraordinary. Men who entered the prison sane lost their capacity for coherent thought within months, some within weeks. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State in 1842. He was on an American tour. He had been a vocal critic of the British prison system, and he arrived in Philadelphia expecting to be impressed. The Quakers had presented their system as the most enlightened in the world. Dickens entered the building with an open mind. He left with a conclusion that would become one of the most cited passages in the history of penal reform. Dickens wrote in his American notes, __, quote _0 __. Dickens was not a doctor. He was not a reformer. He was a novelist with an eye for suffering. And what he saw in those cells, behind those hoods, beneath those skylights, was a suffering so total and so invisible that it could continue forever without anyone on the outside knowing it was happening. He called it torture. Not reform, not penitence, torture. The response from the administrators of Eastern State was predictable. They dismissed him. A literary man, an Englishman, someone who did not understand the science of moral reformation. The system was sound, they insisted. The theology was correct. The occasional breakdown was regrettable but inevitable. Some souls were too far gone for even divine light to reach. And so the system continued. But Dickens was not the only voice, not the earliest, and not the loudest. A physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride was practicing in Philadelphia during the early years of Eastern State. Kirkbride would later become one of the most influential figures in the history of American mental health. He designed the Kirkbride Plan for asylum architecture, and he observed the prisoners transferring from Eastern State to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane with increasing frequency and increasing severity. Kirkbride did not publish a polemic. He was a clinician. He simply documented what arrived at his door, and what arrived at. Their skin was unbroken, the damage was somewhere else, and the shipments kept coming. Now, Eastern State Penitentiary was not the only experiment in solitary confinement. The system it pioneered had a name. It was called the Pennsylvania System, or the Separate System. And it had a rival, the Auburn System, developed at Auburn Prison in New York, which allowed prisoners to work together during the day in enforced silence and isolated them only at night. The Auburn system was cheaper, it produced revenue from prison labor, and it did not produce the same catastrophic rate of mental disintegration. This was not a subtle difference. This was a controlled experiment on a national scale. Two systems running simultaneously in the same country with the same population of offenders. One produced functional prisoners who could at least work. The other produced men who rocked in corners and screamed at walls. And the debate between the two systems consumed American penology for decades. You would think the data would settle it. You would think the medical logs and the transfer rates and the testimony of physicians and the words of Charles Dickens would be sufficient. You would think that a system which visibly destroyed the minds of its subjects would be abandoned. It was not abandoned. It was exploited. Between 1830 and 1880, more than 300 institutions across the world adopted the Eastern State model. Pentonville Prison in London, opened in 1842, the same year Dickens published his warning, was built on the separate system. Within its first year of operation, the rate of mental breakdown among prisoners was so high that the authorities introduced a maximum duration for isolation. Not because they rejected the theory, because the evidence was impossible to hide. Pentonville reduced isolation from 18 months to 9 months, then to 4 months, Each reduction was accompanied by a corresponding reduction in the rate of insanity. The correlation was exact. The longer the isolation, the more minds it destroyed. This was not ambiguous data. This was a dose-response curve. In France, similar institutions produced similar results. In Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. Every country that imported the model imported the madness along with it. And still, the theory survived. At Eastern State itself, the pure separate system gradually eroded over the decades. By the 1860s, overcrowding had made true isolation impossible. Cells designed for one housed 2 or 3. The exercise yards were converted into additional cell blocks. The silence rule was unenforced and unenforceable. By the early 20th century, Eastern State Penitentiary had become, ironically, exactly what it was designed to replace: a crowded, chaotic, conventional prison. It closed in 1970. The building was abandoned. Rain fell through the skylights. Trees grew in the cell blocks. The eye of God went blind. And you might think this is where the story ends. An experiment that failed. A theology that was wrong. A building that crumbled. A lesson learned. Except the lesson was not learned. There is a phrase in institutional history that Blackwell encounters again and again. It appears in commission reports, in parliamentary transcripts, in the minutes of oversight boards. The phrase is, "Lessons were learned." Lessons were learned after Pentonville. Lessons were learned after Eastern State. Lessons were learned after every psychiatric study, every prisoner lawsuit, every United Nations report, every documented case of a human mind unraveling in a concrete box. And then it happened again. On October 14, 1983, 2 guards were killed at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Thomas Silverstein, an inmate already serving multiple life sentences, stabbed Officer Merle Klutz in the corridor of the control unit. Hours later, in a separate incident, another inmate killed Officer Robert Hoffman. The warden locked down the prison, every prisoner to his cell. No movement, no contact, no recreation, no human interaction of any kind. The lockdown was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 23 years. Marion became the first modern Supermax facility in the United States. Not by design, by reaction, by fear. And the conditions inside Marion were, in their essential architecture, identical to those inside Eastern State Penitentiary 154 years earlier. A prisoner in a cell, alone, 22 to 24 hours a day, meals through a slot, exercise in a cage, no human touch, no human conversation. The silence was not enforced by wrapped wagon wheels. It was enforced by concrete and steel and distance. But the silence was the same, and the results were the same. Stuart Gracian is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School. In 1983, the same year Marion went into lockdown, Gracian began studying the psychological effects of solitary confinement. He interviewed prisoners in the Walpole Special Housing Unit in Massachusetts. His findings, published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, described a syndrome so consistent across subjects that he could identify it almost immediately. Hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, hallucinations, panic attacks, difficulty thinking, difficulty concentrating, memory loss, paranoia, impulse control problems. Gracian called it SHU syndrome, after the special housing unit where most solitary confinement occurred. He described the progression with clinical precision. First, the prisoner becomes hypersensitive. Sounds that a person in general population would not notice become overwhelming. The hum of fluorescent lights, the clang of a distant door. The prisoner's nervous system, starved of input, begins amplifying everything. Then the perceptual distortions begin. Walls appear to move. The cell seems to shrink or expand. Colors shift. The prisoner cannot tell if an hour has passed or a day. Then the hallucinations. Voices first, then visual. A man who has been in solitary for 60 days may see figures standing in his cell. He knows they are not real. He can tell you they are not real. But he sees them. And after 90 days, he may no longer be certain they are not real. Then the cognitive dissolution. The prisoner loses the ability to organize his thoughts. Sentences fragment. Attention collapses. A man who could read a book cannot follow a paragraph. A man who could write a letter cannot form a coherent sentence. Gracian tested these subjects carefully. He ruled out pre-existing conditions. He tracked the timing. The syndrome appeared after isolation and resolved, at least partially, after isolation ended. It was not a coincidence. It was not a predisposition. It was a direct, predictable, reproducible consequence of prolonged solitary confinement. He published these findings. They were peer-reviewed. They were cited. They were presented to courts. And the use of solitary confinement in the United States increased. In 1994, the federal government opened ADX Florence in Colorado, the administrative maximum facility, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It was purpose-built for permanent solitary confinement, not a lockdown imposed after a crisis like Marion. A building designed from the blueprint stage for total human isolation. The cells at ADX Florence are 87 square feet. There is a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, a stainless steel toilet and sink combination, a narrow window 4 inches wide, angled so that the prisoner can see only the sky. No horizon, no ground, no trees, no other building, just sky. Prisoners at ADX Florence spend 22 to 24 hours a day in these cells. Recreation consists of 1 hour in a slightly larger concrete enclosure, also alone, also enclosed, also with a narrow view of sky. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. Medical examinations take place through the slot or in a caged holding area. Human contact is functionally non-existent. The architecture is different from Eastern State. The materials are different. The theology is absent. But the operating principle is identical. Remove the human being from all human connection. Seal him in silence. Wait for something to change. What changes is the brain. Neuroscience has, in the decades since Gracian's initial work, provided the biological mechanism for what the Quakers observed in 1830 and chose not to understand. The human brain is a social organ. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural fact. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, and the capacity to imagine other minds, develops through social interaction and is maintained through social interaction. Remove the interaction and the region begins to deteriorate. Studies using functional MRI imaging on subjects after prolonged isolation show measurable changes in brain structure. The prefrontal cortex thins. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, shrinks. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat, becomes hyperactive. The brain does not simply suffer from loneliness. It physically reorganizes itself to survive in an environment of total deprivation. And the reorganization is incompatible with normal human function. Craig Haney, a psychologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, has studied solitary confinement for over 30 years. His research describes a phenomenon he calls social death. The isolated prisoner does not merely feel lonely. His capacity for social connection atrophies. Like a muscle that is never used, the neural architecture of human bonding wastes away. And when the prisoner is eventually released, if he is released, he finds that the world is unbearable. not because it is dangerous, but because it is full of people, and people have become, biologically, overwhelming. Haney documented prisoners who could not make eye contact after release, prisoners who could not tolerate being in a room with more than one other person, prisoners who could not ride a bus, who could not sit in a restaurant, who could not hold a conversation for more than a few minutes before their attention fractured and the walls started to close in and the panic began. These men had no injuries, no scars, no broken bones. They had been stored, carefully, quietly, in clean cells with functioning plumbing and 3 meals a day and a narrow view of the sky. And they emerged with brains that no longer worked the way human brains are supposed to work. There is a number that appears repeatedly in the research literature. The number is 15. 15 days. Juan Mendez, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, stated in 2011 that solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Beyond 15 days, the risk of permanent psychological damage becomes significant. 15 days. The average duration of solitary confinement in the United States federal prison system is not 15 days. It is not 30. It is not 90. In 2014, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reported that approximately 80,000 prisoners were held in solitary confinement in the United States on any given day. Many for months, many for years, some for decades. Thomas Silverstein, the man whose act of violence triggered the Marion lockdown, spent the last 36 years of his life in solitary confinement. 36 years. From 1983 until his death in 2019. He was held in conditions where he had no physical contact with another human being for years at a stretch. He was 67 years old when he died. He had spent more than half his life in a concrete box. Albert Woodfox spent 43 years in solitary confinement in the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. 43 years. He was placed in isolation in 1972 and released in 2016. He was convicted of murdering a prison guard, a conviction he disputed until his death. The question of his guilt or innocence is not the point Blackwell is making here. The point is 43 years. The point is that a human being was kept in a 6 by 9 foot cell for 23 hours a day for 43 consecutive years in a country that sent delegations to Eastern State Penitentiary in 1831 to marvel at the innovation. The pattern is not subtle. The pattern is not ambiguous. The pattern is a straight line drawn on a map from 1829 to today, and every point on that line is marked with the same notation. Isolation produces madness. There is a phrase in engineering, root cause analysis. When a system fails, you trace the failure back to its origin, not the proximate cause, not the trigger, the root cause, the structural flaw that made the failure inevitable. The root cause of solitary confinement is not cruelty. That is what makes it so durable. Cruelty can be recognized. Cruelty can be named. Cruelty produces outrage. The root cause is something else entirely. The root cause is a theory about human nature that is wrong. The Quakers believed that a human being, stripped of all external influence, would naturally gravitate toward God, that the inner light would emerge when the noise stopped, that silence was not deprivation but liberation, that isolation was not punishment but opportunity. This theory is wrong in a way that neuroscience can now explain with precision. The human brain does not gravitate toward clarity in isolation. It gravitates toward dissolution. The inner light does not emerge. The inner light goes out. But the theory is elegant. It is simple. It is satisfying. It places no burden on the institution to provide anything. No programs, no therapy, No education, no human interaction. Just a cell and a door and time. The cheapest possible intervention. The most passive possible approach. Lock the door and wait. And when the waiting produces madness instead of penitence, the theory has a ready-made explanation. The prisoner was too far gone, the soul too damaged, the inner light too dim. The failure is never the system. The failure is always the man. That logic has not changed in 200 years. When a prisoner in a modern Supermax facility deteriorates psychologically, the institutional response is remarkably consistent with the response at Eastern State in 1830. The prisoner is observed. The deterioration is documented. Medication may be offered through the slot in the door, and the isolation continues. The logic is circular and unbreakable. The prisoner is in solitary because he is dangerous. The prisoner is dangerous because he is psychologically unstable. The prisoner is psychologically unstable because of the solitary confinement. Therefore, the prisoner must remain in solitary because he is dangerous. A federal judge named Thelton Henderson described this cycle in the case of Madrid versus Gomez in 1995. He wrote that conditions in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison in California quote, _1__ for healthy prisoners and crossed the line into unconstitutional conditions for those with mental illness. He ordered reforms. The reforms were slow, partial, contested at every level. Pelican Bay continued to house prisoners in solitary confinement for years after the ruling. Some prisoners had been in the SHU for over 20 years at the time of Henderson's decision. They remained there after it. In 2011, prisoners at Pelican Bay launched a hunger strike. It spread to 13 prisons across California. 30,000 prisoners refused food. Their demands included an end to indefinite solitary confinement. The strike lasted 60 days. The state negotiated. A review process was established. Prisoners were gradually moved out of the SHU. Gradually. Over years. After decades of confinement. And Pelican Bay is one institution in one state. Across the United States, the machinery hums. ADX Florence continues to operate. State-level Supermax facilities continue to operate. County jails across the country use solitary confinement routinely. Juveniles are held in isolation. Mentally ill prisoners are held in isolation. Pregnant women have been held in isolation. The number 80,000 is not historical. It is current. On any given day in the United States, roughly 80,000 human beings are in solitary confinement. The actual number may be higher. The Bureau of Justice Statistics acknowledges that data collection is inconsistent across jurisdictions. Some facilities do not call it solitary confinement. They call it administrative segregation, protective custody, restricted housing, special management unit. The names change. The cell does not. 87 square feet, 23 hours a day, a slot for food, a narrow window angled toward the sky, and silence. The same silence that John Haviland engineered in 1821, the same silence that broke prisoner number 44 in 1830, the same silence that Dickens called torture in 1842, the same silence that Gracian mapped onto a psychiatric syndrome in 1983, the same silence that Mendez called cruel and inhuman in 2011. The same silence. Продолжаю скрипт с того места, где он оборвался. The same silence that has not changed in 200 years because the theory behind it has not changed in 200 years. And here is where Blackwell needs to be precise, because there is a temptation at this point in the story to say, the system is evil, the people who run it are cruel, the solution is obvious. The system is not evil, that is the problem. Evil can be confronted. Evil has a face. Evil makes a decision and can be held accountable for that decision. What Eastern State Penitentiary created was something more durable than evil. It created a bureaucratic process, a set of procedures, a flow of paperwork, a chain of decisions in which no single person is responsible for the outcome, and every single person is following the rules. The warden follows policy. The policy was written by the department. The department follows the legislation. The legislation was passed by representatives. The representatives responded to voters who wanted to feel safe. The voters never saw the inside of a cell, and the prisoner sits in silence, and the silence is no one's fault. That is the architecture of the machine, not stone and mortar, not Gothic walls and iron doors. The architecture is diffusion of responsibility across a system so large that accountability evaporates before it reaches any single human being. John Haviland designed a building, but the building was only the housing for something older and more resilient. The belief that you can fix a person by subtracting the world from them. The belief that emptiness is a treatment. The belief that if you take away a man's shadow, the light that remains will be divine. The light that remains is not divine. The light that remains is a fluorescent tube in a concrete ceiling, buzzing at 60 Hz, 24 hours a day, in a cell where a human brain is slowly eating itself because it was built over 200,000 years of evolution to exist among other human brains, and it cannot survive without them. Blackwell started this video with a question. Can you save a man by taking away his shadow? The shadow is not a metaphor. The shadow is what falls behind you when you stand among other people. It is the proof that you are not alone. It is the shape your existence casts upon the world when there is someone else there to see it. Take away the shadow, and the man does not become holy. He does not repent. He does not find God or clarity or peace. He disappears. Not physically. Physically he remains. 87 square feet, 3 meals through a slot, a narrow window angled toward the sky. But the person who entered that cell, the one with a name and a voice and the capacity to look another human being in the eye and understand what he sees there, that person is gone, replaced by something the medical literature calls a syndrome and the institutional paperwork calls an administrative outcome, and the architecture of Eastern State Penitentiary called, with absolute sincerity, salvation. 200 years, the same machine, the same silence, the same results, and on any given day, 80,000 shadows missing. In the last video, Blackwell traced what happens when you isolate a person from the world for their own protection. Next time, Blackwell is going to a valley in California where a man isolated an entire ecosystem from its water supply and called it progress. The Owens Valley, the river that Los Angeles stole, and the dust that has not settled since.